my time at ESPN was don't make your work your God. You don't
Hmm.
want to do that. And a lot of
Yeah.
people do that. I've done that. I've even done that with Sports Spectrum, but you want to remember that your work is important. Be great, serve others, do your work with excellence, but then don't sweat it if something goes wrong. Like, your work is not who you are. It's just what you do. Who you are is who God has called you to be, which is his child. It's who you identify as. I identify as a follower of Christ. So that's my identity. It's not in my job or any work that I've ever done.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Welcome to Christ Show, a show where we inspire the masses to become financially free while building God's kingdom. On the show today, we have Mr. Jason Romano. Mr. Jason is the host of the Sports Spectrum podcast, author, and a former ESPN producer. In this episode, we'll be discussing Mr. Jason's success as a Christian media professional. So thank you for being here, Mr. Jason.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Donnie. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Doing well. It's a nice day. No complaints. I mean, I don't usually have too many bad days, thankfully. God is good, and that's kind of where my hope lies. So I don't need to worry about, you know, whether it's a good day or a bad day. It's always a great day because I have the Lord. So
Thank God for that. And how did you get started into media, or how did you get introduced to being a media professional?
yeah, it's something I was always interested in as a kid, especially after I realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete, which is, if you're a sports buff, that's something you're always interested
Yeah.
in doing. But once I realized that sports wasn't, going to be something I could play professionally, the next best thing was broadcasting. And so that's what I went to college for. I got my associate's degree and my 2-year degree at a community college, and then a 4-year degree at a university. And all of that was under the realm of sports, media, radio and TV, broadcasting, and just kind of did everything I could in college to learn about that profession, with the hopes that I would get a job in that area one day. Thankfully, it worked out. I worked in local radio, then I got a job at ESPN, and now I'm working with Sports Spectrum. So I've been involved in the media space for 25 years, 26 years, but really, when it goes back to college, it's been over 30 years since I've had this desire and this interest to go into the media world. So yeah, it's been quite the journey.
Now that's quite a journey. And one thing that that kind of I can relate to, because I was an athlete for the majority of my life. And oftentimes as first, my first question is, what kind of athlete were you? What kind of sports did you play?
Yeah. When I was a kid, I started first playing baseball. That was my sport. I was a little league all-star. I have my trophy downstairs still, which is funny. I was a pitcher, shortstop, played baseball. And then as I got older, probably into age 11, I started playing basketball and made my 7th and 8th grade basketball team. We called it the modified junior high team. And played basketball there and really fell in love with the game of basketball. I was still playing baseball a little bit, but basketball became my favorite sport to play, the one I was most good at, if you will. And I
Yeah.
played that through high school. Wasn't very good. I played here and there. Didn't average a ton of points. My senior year, I think I was the 6th man off the bench. But I actually, after I finished high school, I started playing pickup with a lot of really good guys, and I got much better. And I actually played a semester of community college basketball. So I didn't even start in my senior year of my high school team, but I played a little community college basketball on the team that I went to college for. And then just played a bunch of pickup in leagues and church leagues for years and years until I stopped playing about 2-3 years ago. But basketball was my sport. I love football. It's probably my favorite sport to watch is football. I just never played it. I don't know if I could have been a good football player, but I just decided early on I didn't want the physical contact and I guess all the hard training that it required to be a football player. So I passed on that.
I, I can definitely relate because one thing that just came to mind when I was in high school, I used to run track. And, track people, we known to be in shape and things of that sort. And there's this position open, or this the coach at my brother's school, he wanted me to come there running back. And me knowing a lot about, the brain injuries and things like that, so I declined. I was like, oh, I don't know if I can take all those hits. And now
Yeah.
looking back, yes, what if I did play? But who knows? Like who knows what would happen?
You
But
never know. You never know.
you're right. You never know. And I do love basketball. I'm a Knicks fan. For those of me I know, I love watching Knicks. I do play recreation basketball as well.
Mm.
When I'm free, myself, relax as well. But one thing I was trying to, was trying to go on when I first started was because oftentimes as athletes, you can get caught up in, we gotta make it to the league. We gotta do this. And that's the only way that we see that we can be part of that sport. So when did you realize, like, okay, I'm not gonna make it to the league in basketball. I'm not gonna go overseas. Um, you may pick up basketball every weekend. Like, how did you come to that realization, and look into me as a different option?
It was high school. I mean, when I was a sophomore in high school, I think you could tell that I was a sports nerd because I remember what I averaged point wise in high school. And my sophomore year, I was starting. I averaged about 8.5 a game, almost 10 points a game. I remember scoring, I think it was 16 or 18 points in one of the games. That was my best game I ever had in high school. And, there I realized, okay, I'm in high school on the JV basketball team in 10th grade, averaging less than 10 points a game. Those guys don't go to the league. They don't even go and play in college. So I pretty much realized quickly that this basketball journey that I was on, which was just doing it for fun and playing in high school was a lot of fun, that wasn't going to take me anywhere. And then I started thinking, when I was in 11th grade, I started looking at colleges and, majors and what do I want to do here and there, for the rest of my life? What would be a fun thing to do? And there were ideas about going into becoming a meteorologist. Like fascinated by the weather. So that was there. I had no desire to be a doctor or be any kind of like accountant or anything like that. I don't know. I always loved sports. And so I set my goal and desire to work in sports. And I didn't know what that meant exactly, but if I could be in sports and somebody would pay me, I felt like that was the best thing in the world. And so broadcasting, again, being a sports junkie, I would watch every single game and I keep stats and collect baseball cards and have all the magazines and the books and fight my brothers for the newspaper to read the sports page when I was a kid, like whatever it took to get my sports fix. And so for me, it was natural to, well, if I can't play sports forever, I can at least talk about it or study it or be involved in it. And media just seemed like a natural way to cover sports if I could end up doing that. Like when I got to college, I told the people that I was, that were my professors and the people that were running the radio stations, like, I'm going to be one of your sports guys because that's what I want to do. I don't want to do news. I don't want to do politics. I'll be a DJ if you want me to on the radio, but my desire is to work in sports. And, my first 2 years in college at 18 years old, 19 years old, I was doing play by play for our community college basketball team, the one I actually ended up playing on. And then my last 2 years of college at the university, I hosted my own sports talk show and just did whatever I could to graduate, to learn about the business and, have fun in college, of course, like everybody. But I had a real, you know, tunnel vision view on going into sports for a career. Again, that doesn't always work out for everybody, and I totally get that. I'm thankful it worked out for me. Let's just put it that way.
So, no, thank God for that. So, I guess my question is, what advice would you give to someone may want to pursue a career into media? What kind of internship? How should they position themselves? To
Mhm.
become successful in this
Yeah,
place?
yeah, it's a great question. I would think, for me, again, because it's been a while since I was in college, but I talk to a lot of young people today, and my daughter's in college now, so I know what the landscape looks like, being and working in media today. first of all, there's never been more opportunities than there are right now to do media. You and I right now, whether you like it or not, or believe it or not, we're doing media. We're recording a podcast together. That didn't exist in 1993 when I was in college, a long time ago. We probably could have recorded something somehow, some way, but it just didn't really exist. That everybody had access to record something and release it for the public to listen to. If you did something, even when I was on the radio station in college, we were doing college radio and the audience was maybe 5 people. It was only heard on campus. And to get people to listen to a radio station on campus when they have thousands of other things to do when you're in college was nearly impossible. So, but you did it because you loved it. My advice, my favorite advice to give, I think, is just to do it. Like, get your hands dirty and get involved. Like, what do you want to do? Figure that out and then just go and do it. Now, it doesn't mean you have, you want to cover the NFL and you want to, cover the Super Bowl or be a sideline reporter. Obviously, not everybody has access to go to an NFL game and be a sideline reporter. But you know what you can do? You can be a sideline reporter at a high school game, because high schools, they'll give you all the access they want as long as you're not disturbing the game. And you got a phone and you can buy a microphone on Amazon for $30, connect it to your phone, and now you can become a sideline reporter just to get that experience, right?
Yeah.
The second thing I tell people is you have access to people who've worked in this business for years in a way that I did not have when I was in college because of social media. Everybody's accessible for the most part.
Yeah.
And you can reach out to people who are sideline reporters or play-by-play broadcasters or producers like I was and say, help me, let me learn from you. Don't ask for anything else other than their time. And you probably got a pretty good shot at reaching those people and getting in touch with them. So that's the second advice. The third advice is internships are important. Don't look for, here's what you don't want to do when you're going into an internship. You don't want to go in expecting to get a job with that company, number one. Number two, you don't want to ask for money. No money, no job. You just go in because you want to learn. Now, hopefully, you'll get a job. Maybe you will. I got a job after I graduated college. I did a post-grad internship. It led to my first job in radio. But that doesn't always work that way. So make sure your expectations are, I simply want to get as much experience and learn as much as I can in the time I'm here. And then hopefully, as you build relationships with different people, the job will come, the money will come. Don't get in this business to make money, especially early on. You're not going to make a lot of money. Work somewhere else, to make money or offset money, but stay in this business if you're passionate about it, not for the money, but because you love it. And, I didn't make a lot of money my first 3 or 4 years working in this business. I was making like 20 grand a year. And it didn't even matter. I worked at a hospital part-time. I worked at a marketing firm part-time, whatever it took. I would work so I could have my own apartment. But ultimately, I started making a little more money. And then when I got to ESPN, thankfully, they paid me enough to where I could, didn't have to have a second or a third job. But don't do it for the money. Do it because you love it and because you want to, go into this business. It's not an easy business. It's very cutthroat, and it's a business where people will definitely burn out if you're not careful. So, go into it because you're passionate. And you don't even have to be passionate about sports, because you said the word media. You didn't say sports media. So if you're passionate about the news, passionate about current affairs, passionate about telling stories, then go into it. And if you're not passionate about those things, it's probably not going to be a good place to go, aspire to work in someday.
No, that is very. I definitely like the breakdown of everything you said, especially the part about internship. I feel like people overlook I guess the opportunity that presented. Just being of service to somebody and being of value. And I want to ask, how did you build your way to becoming the ESPN producer? How did you find yourself there as the ESPN producer?
Yeah, my story is a little different than a lot of people's, because I didn't know anybody at ESPN when I got the job there. A lot of people get jobs at places because they had a connection, they knew someone, they met someone. I didn't know anybody. The uniqueness of my story actually goes back 2 years before I got the job at ESPN, when I was maybe 6 months out of college, and I saw a job posted online for an ESPN producer, and it required, 3 to 5 years of network radio experience. I had 3 to 5 months of local radio experience. I didn't have what the experience was required for this job, but you know what I did? I said, screw it. I'll apply for it anyways. And I applied for the job online, and they called me and they brought me to Bristol, Connecticut, where I still live today. And they interviewed me for this ESPN job. I didn't get it, but I had an interview with them, which was amazing. If the story ended there, I would have been able to tell that to my grandkids. Hey, you know what? I got a job interview at ESPN. But 2 years later, the same exact job opened up at ESPN that I had applied for 2 years earlier. And the same people were doing the interviewing, and they remembered me. Now, I still didn't have the interview or the experience that they were requiring, 3 to 5 years of network experience, but I now had about 2 to 3 years of local radio experience. And that was at least interesting enough for them to bring me back, go through the round of interviews again. And this time I could tell right away that they were very serious about hiring me. I still didn't know if I would get the job, but I went through the process, and ultimately they called me and said, we want to make you an offer. And I said yes, and started my career at ESPN. But, I didn't know anybody. And that's hard to get over right away when you
Yeah.
don't know anybody there, especially in today's age. It's so much about what you know, but it's also about who you know. And at that time, I didn't know anybody. Thankfully, I did go through that round of interviews 2 years earlier, which I think brought my name back to mind when I applied and got the job eventually 2 years later.
That's really good. I have two questions that came to mind as you were speaking. One, I guess I'll start with this. What was your experience like being an ESPN producer? What was your day-to-day schedule like, for someone who may aspire to want to become an ESPN producer?
The day to day was similar but different with all the different jobs. So I in essence had 3 to 4 different jobs in my 17 years at ESPN, right? And so you go in each day and you realize your job is to cover sports. I mean, and they're going to pay you and to work at ESPN to cover sports. So that right there is kind of a kid in a candy store type of job that you have, where you get to go to work every day. And I appreciated it. I loved my time there. I loved working there. Um, so that was, my mindset, I think. But you also realize that you're working at ESPN. So it's like playing baseball for the Yankees or playing, quarterback for the Cowboys. Like the responsibility that comes with working at a place like ESPN, which is the worldwide leader. They dub themselves that in sports. So you know that you have to be on your A game, and you have to provide and produce top level content. And that's, I guess, some pressure, that you come with when you're coming to the work every day, and to do the work every day. My day to day, when I was a producer, I started out as an ESPN radio producer, and I would come in and I would gather the, stories and think about who we were going to interview on the shows. And then we would do the show. And then when the show was over, we would get ready for the next day. Uh, then when I moved to television in 2003, so 3.5 years after I started, I was working on a show called Outside the Lines, which is still on at ESPN. And we were doing a lot more interview bookings on topics that you didn't normally talk about in sports. Title IX, steroids, gambling, things like that. Not what was happening on the field. That job was more challenging because there weren't a lot of people that wanted to talk about controversial topics on ESPN. There was a few people, but not many. So you had to kind of really push yourself to, I think, get the different guests that you got on those shows. But then when I left that side of things and I became a full-time talent booker, where I just booked guests, I was working on shows like Sports Center and First Take and Sports Nation when they were a show, and Mike and Mike, when they were a show, NFL Live, which is still on and still around. When I was working on those shows, that was all sports. And so it wasn't easy, but it was a lot of fun. And you
Yeah.
would get guests that, from all different realms of sports. And I loved those years. And that's where I really made many of my contacts and connections was when I was a booker, because I was talking to coaches and athletes and broadcasters and reporters, former players, you name it, and connecting with all of them. So I built a lot of relationships in that 9 years that I spent as a talent booker. And ultimately, I ended my career there going into this new media called social media. And I was a social media producer at ESPN my last 4 years. And that allowed me to learn about a new genre, learn about a new media, telling stories on a different kind of platform, and then ultimately working for the NFL at ESPN and working on uh, what did I do? Major League Baseball at ESPN, doing their social media, and finishing up my career on Mike and Mike in the Morning, doing a morning radio show on
Wow.
ESPN for their social media. So I had such a great time working there. I'm so thankful. But the days were different. Ultimately, though, it was sports. And you come in every day and you say, okay, what's going to happen in sports that we're going to talk about or react to? Mostly good stuff, and sometimes bad stuff. But that's kind of what it was, and you're always thinking like a producer. So if a story happens, my mind goes to who can we talk to? What's the kind of content that we want to get around topics that are happening like this? When an athlete or a famous person passes away, I remember when Muhammad Ali died, I think it was 2016. I was working on Mike and Mike, and we were like, all right, who are the guests that we're going to talk about with regards to Muhammad Ali's legacy? Who are
Yeah.
the people that knew him? What are the fights that he fought in? What were some of the things that he did off the, field, away from the ring, that he was so heavily involved with activism, right? And even, the Olympics and things like that. So you go into producer mode and you start to think about those things. And then ultimately it's what goes on air that matters the most. When a show is on the air, what are we talking about? What are we doing? What kind of guest are we getting? And that's the end result of everything that we do or did at ESPN, was ultimately what is going to go on that program that people are going to watch and see every day.
That's really amazing. And I want to ask, what are some lessons, like if you can give like, one or two lessons that you learned um from working at ESPN that you still hold to this day?
Yeah, number one, you can't do it alone. I think a lot of people at ESPN feel like the responsibility is on themselves to be great, right? And so they're always looking to climb the corporate ladder or to have the next promotion or to be great. And the responsibility falls on them and them alone. I used to think that way. But ultimately, I came away from that realizing that that's not how it works. Like in life, in faith, and even at your job like ESPN, like we cannot do this alone. We need each other. And so if you go in with a mindset of serving your teammates every day, and this transfers onto the field as well. If you're a part of a sports team, if you go in wanting to serve your teammates every day and be the best that you can be for them, you're going to be great too. And ultimately the team's going to be great. And so these shows that I just referenced, right? Ultimately, the end product is what goes out on these shows on ESPN every day. If you try to do all that by yourself, it's not going to work out so well. But if you
Wow.
get your team involved, right? And we had teams, man, I had some great teammates that I worked with at ESPN. And when we were all on the same page working to serve each other, that's when the greatness happened. So that lesson carries with me to today, right? Where I work very individually in the job I'm in right now with Sports Spectrum, but I know I have a team that I love and that I want to serve and that I know I have to rely on for us to be really, really great. And that's a lesson that I think will stick with me forever. One more lesson I think to remember that I got out of ESPN, and I got to remember it even now with Sports Spectrum, is that I am not identified by the job that I do and by
Mm.
where I work. And even before I was a Christian, I got so caught up in being known as the guy who worked at ESPN or being known as an ESPN producer. But after I became a follower of Christ, and it took me about 10 years to get this, so it took me a long time, I realized that I was not an ESPN producer who happened to be a Christian. I was a follower of Christ who happened to be an ESPN producer. I was a follower of Christ who happened to be a husband and a dad. Like, my faith in Christ had to come first. So my advice for people, or the lesson I take away from my time at ESPN, was don't make your work your God. You don't
Mm,
want to do that. And a lot of
yeah.
people do that. I've done that. I've even done that with Sports Spectrum. But you want to remember that your work is important. Be great, serve others, do your work with excellence, but then don't sweat it if something goes wrong. Like, your work is not who you are. It's just what you do. Who you are is who God has called you to be, which is his child. It's who you identify as. I identify as a follower of Christ. So that's my identity. It's not in my job or any work that I've ever done.
Hey family, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. And if you are and you have yet to subscribe to us here on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. And also, if you're listening to us on Apple Podcast and you have yet to leave us a 5-star review, please do so. Now back to the episode.
I think that's very powerful. And, I want you to kind of ask, how has your faith, from going from ESPN to Sports Spectrum, like help you through this whole process, of being a Christian media professional?
It's helped me a lot. I mean, it's a newer faith. I mean, I say newer now. I'm at 22 years that I've been a Christian, but I was 27 when I became a Christian.
Mm,
After the first 27 years, I'm still not halfway through my life of being a follower of Christ yet. So when I think about that, I still feel like a new believer, even though I've been a Christian for 22 years. Uh, my faith helped me at ESPN, but not initially. Initially, I thought my faith was something that you just did on Sundays at church, and maybe you go to a Bible study. And then when I go to my job, that's my job. But I
yeah.
realized somewhere around 10 years into my career at ESPN that, it's like what I said earlier, like, my job was becoming my God, but it wasn't supposed to be that way. And that I could go to ESPN as a follower of Christ first and understand that I could be a light, I could be an ambassador for Jesus at ESPN without preaching at anybody and without banging a Bible over anybody's head. I would never do that. But I was a follower of Christ everywhere I went. So I could take that with me to ESPN and try to be as Christ-like as possible, which meant serving others, which meant loving people, which meant being there for them, which meant praying for them. That's not something we think about when we go to our jobs, but
Yeah.
God wants us to pray for others, um, including those that we don't agree with or that
Yeah.
kind of drive us nuts. Pray for those that persecute you, Jesus said. So I think my faith helped me in that respect to see people as Christ would see them, as people that he loves. Certainly the work I'm in now with Sports Spectrum is the most, I guess it's the most impactful work or purposeful work I've ever done, because now I get to tell people about Jesus through sports, which is
Yeah.
not what I would ever have thought would take place when I was, coming up through college. But it's everything I always wanted to do, and I didn't even realize it. Like hosting a show, wanted to do that since I was in college, never did that at ESPN. Being able to interview some of my heroes in sports, always wanted to do that. Being able to tell amazing stories and share these powerful, impactful stories, always wanted to do that. Just never thought that it would be because I was a follower of Christ and I have this platform that I get to work with, Sports Spectrum, to tell stories of sports and faith. I never thought that would take place, but here we are. And I've been there 6 years, and I think the work that we do is really good. It's not just important work, but it's good work. And I think it
Yeah.
honors God too. Like, we want to produce really high quality content to be able to tell these stories, and that's been our goal since I got there, and hopefully that'll continue as long as God wants me to do it.
Now that is amazing. And I want to kind of ask, real quick, what inspired you to leave, ESPN and pursue a sport ministry?
Yeah.
What was that process like for you?
Yeah, it wasn't something I was seeking out. my faith was growing. By 2015, I had been a Christian for 14 years at that point. I was pretty solid and firm in my faith at that point, but I was also about 42, I think I was at the time, 41. And I started thinking about, when you hit that age 40 range, you start to think about halftime of life. I'm going to be 50 soon. So now I'm thinking about, is this halftime? Because that means I'm going to get to 100. I don't know. We'll see. I might be midway through the third quarter of life right now. Who knows? But when you hit 40, you start to think about halftime, right? Is this
Yeah.
time? What am I going to do? Am I going to work at ESPN for the rest of my life? And I think I would have been okay doing that. I really do. I don't think I would have lasted because I just see the layoffs and the cuts and the different directions that they've gone in. I probably wouldn't have been able to make it as long as maybe some others did. But I just felt like God was saying, I want you to do more for me. And I'm like, all right, well, I don't know what doing more for you looks like, but I'll keep my ears open and I'll keep my hands open, and whatever you want, Lord, let's go. Ultimately, what that meant was moving from ESPN to go into ministry with Sports Spectrum. And, it's weird to say ministry because it is ministry, but at the
Yeah.
same time, it's also media. Like the last 6 years, we've been doing media, but we've also been doing ministry. And ironically, within our four walls of working at Sports Spectrum, we call it our media ministry. There's our media ministry, there's our event ministry. Those are the two pillars of what Sports Spectrum's overarching company is about. And we're the media ministry. So I combine the two, right? And so it's definitely ministry because I believe God has called me into this place to do his work, but it's media, and it's still editing and doing interviews and booking guests and, sharing those with other people, sharing stories. That's media. And so we don't try to hide from either of those two things, media or ministry. But ultimately, it was a really hard decision to say yes and leave because I was very comfortable at ESPN. I didn't want to leave a really good paying job with a lot of nice benefits. But if I didn't do it at the time I did it, I don't know if I would have done it, let's say, at the stage of life I'm in right now. If
Mm.
I got to 50 years old and I was still at ESPN, by that time, I'm probably not trying to make a move that might not work,
Yeah.
or take a chance, if that makes sense, like I took when I was 40. Um, but I'm glad I took it. It worked out because God made it work out, not because anything I did. And now I can't imagine not working for the company that I work with today, Sports Spectrum. There's probably will or may come a day where I'm not working with Sports Spectrum. I don't know. I'm not going to be the judge of that, but I love my job. I love my bosses. I love my teammates, and I'll work there as long as they will allow me to, because I think I have the greatest job in the world. I really do.
Now that's really amazing. And I want to ask, because one thing that keeps circling around is about content, and how you go about content. My first question is, I do have ESPN app, and I follow all you guys all over social media and everything about sports. I love it. But the question I always have is, how do you guys go about picking the story? Why you guys say I'm gonna pick a story about Westbrook, versus LeBron or versus anybody in any kind of sports? What goes behind psychology? What goes behind picking the story that you guys are gonna share?
So I'll tell you my answer from an ESPN producer when I was there, and I'll tell you my answer with Sports Spectrum. So being an ESPN producer, we were trying to tell the stories that we felt would get the most eyeballs watching and the stories that most people cared about. And so that's why you would see ESPN doing a LeBron story every single day. Now, it can feel like, why are they covering LeBron so much? But guess what? The ratings go up when LeBron
Mm,
James is on ESPN. And so ratings ultimately mean eyeballs, which ultimately means advertising and dollars and money. And they're a business, ESPN. They are there to cover sports and serve sports fans, but they are also a business. And so they are there for the bottom line. And that is to attract as many people as possible to watch their content and to read their content. So that's why they choose what they choose. I remember when Brett Favre was still playing in the NFL, Brett Favre was one of those guys that when he did anything,
Yeah.
ESPN covered it. And so we used to joke, oh, Brett Favre just went outside and walked his dog. Okay, that's going to lead ESPN today, you know? So obviously that wasn't the case, but it felt that way.
Yeah.
So somebody like Brett Favre, somebody like Barry Bonds, who was very controversial in the early 2000s when I got to ESPN, people like that, ESPN covered a lot because that meant ratings and that meant eyeballs in their eyes. You know, they covered the Dallas this is still the case today with
Yeah.
ESPN. They covered the Dallas Cowboys as the greatest team in the history of sports. And I'm just going to fully put this out there. I've been a Dallas Cowboys fan since 1979. I love the Cowboys. That's my team. However, even I got tired of coming to work and talking about the Cowboys every day because I don't know. I just felt like we're just manufacturing stories. But listen, you can't hide from the ratings. Every
Yeah.
time the Cowboys were talked about, ratings went up. So that's why you see even today Stephen A. Smith and First Take talking about the Cowboys because they know that people are watching. The only reason, if nobody watched when they talked about the Cowboys, they would find the next team to talk about that everybody would watch. That's why they did the Tim Tebow story for years and years at ESPN. That's why LeBron is so famous and big. Even Kobe when he was still alive, like and still playing. Those guys it moved the needle, as they call it. If you ever listen to a top 40 radio station, they play the same song every hour,
Yeah.
right? It's called playing the hits. This is what ESPN did. They played the hits. The hits were the Cowboys, LeBron, Barry Bonds, Ken Griffey Jr.,
Brady.
Tom Brady. That's right. They were the hits. So that's what they do. They treat their content like a radio station playing music. Now, fast forwarding to where I am today at Sports Spectrum, it's much different. But our goal at Sports Spectrum is to get eyeballs and to have people listen and get ears listen to our podcast. We do want to grow an audience, but we will not do it trying to compromise our faith and not talk about Jesus. That's the goal. The goal ultimately is not to have 1 million subscribers to whatever. That would be great. The goal is ultimately to share the gospel of Christ through the lens of sports. If it's one person or if it's 1 million people, then we've done our job. Ultimately, I know our audience is nice and a good size. It's not ESPN size by any means. But when we've had 4.5 million downloads of a podcast in 6 years, or had close to 8 million people go to our website over the last 3 or 4 years, you realize God's doing something there too.
Yeah.
Not ESPN numbers, but we try to be, again, obedient to the work that we've been called to do it with excellence, and do it with the right mindset and purpose in mind, again, to point people to Christ. And so we talk about keeping Jesus in the sports conversation, not just faith, but Jesus. And that's what we focus on. And again, the mindset's different, way different than ESPN, although we are a business too. We need to make money, and we are looking for more people to listen to our content and read our content. But ultimately, we're not in it for that. God will take care of that. We are solely in this to share the gospel. We're just using sports as a nice way to do that.
That's amazing. And I want to ask, through your years of experience, what would you say is the most memorable experience you've had, whether it's at Sports Spectrum or ESPN? What has been a very memorable experience for you? Like,
okay, they overlap each other, so you'll like this. So at ESPN in 2009, I was a talent producer, talent booker, and I had booked a guest named Darryl Strawberry. Darryl Strawberry, I'm glad you're shaking your head, you know who he is. He was a Mets player, legendary baseball player, my favorite player as a kid too, by the way, because I'm a New York Mets fan. And Darryl Strawberry came to ESPN. I got to spend the day with him and take him around from show to show, produce the content for that day. Leaving that day, Darryl Strawberry and I now were friends. I'm just going to say it. Like, he asked me for my number. He said, I want to stay in touch. Darryl was a Christian, is a Christian. Darryl had substance abuse issues. He had father issues. I had father issues and a dad who was an alcoholic. We connected on a deeper level than just ESPN or sports.
Yeah.
That's 2009. So that's 14 years ago. Fast forward to 2018, and Daryl and I had reconnected, and he wrote the foreword of my first book, Live to Forgive, which is crazy to see that I have a book with his name and my name on it. But then this is my most memorable moment. I had an opportunity to interview him for my podcast. I've never been, Dami, more nervous for an interview in my life, because even though I had known him, even though we were friends, I suddenly was going back to being 10 years old and remembering rooting for this guy as a fifth grader, as a sixth grader, as a seventh grader, and thinking he was the greatest thing ever. And here's God right now allowing me with a microphone to talk to him and interview him. And it was a very, very surreal moment. Yeah, it was. And since then, I've gotten to interview him, I think, 3 other times. So God is good, and it allowed me to have really great conversations with my sports hero. God is good that he's allowed me to have a friendship with my sports hero. In fact, you'll laugh at this, but a couple of weeks ago at spring training, Daryl was in Port St. Lucie with the Mets, and I'm watching a spring training Mets game, and the game was over, and I had SMY on still, and the game was, in its post game commentary, and I look at my phone and it rings, and it's Daryl Strawberry, and he's in his hotel in Port St. Lucie. It's like, Jason, I'm just checking in on you, brother. How are you? I want to check in on you. I miss you. And I'm like, hey, Daryl, it's great to hear from you. I update him on how things are going. And he does that like twice a year, just calls me out of the blue to check on me and to see how I'm doing. And that's insane to me that he would care enough about me. Who am I? I'm just a dude. I'm just one of his millions of fans that probably loved him when he was playing. But we have a deeper connection because of our faith in Jesus. And Daryl is the real deal. And he does that. He just calls and checks in on me and asks how I'm doing. And so you want to talk about greatest moments ever, or most memorable moments, you combine those. From ESPN is where it started, and here we are, 6 years into Sports Spectrum and 13 years into a friendship that I hope I have till to the day he or I pass on and go be with Jesus. So
that's really amazing, and it kind of like I want to ask, how do you go about building this relationship? I can just imagine not every time you reach out to one of these athletes, depending on their start on their fan base, how do you go about approaching interviewing athletes or other personalities on your Sports Spectrum podcast?
yeah, it's different places that you meet them. Some are relationships that I had with people at ESPN. Some are relationships that I've made outside of just Sports Spectrum at different conferences or even places that I've spoken at. But whenever I meet someone, I try to get their number, try to connect with them. And, I try not to abuse the relationship. I'm not trying to ever ask for anything from them other than their time. Very much like I told the college kid, all you're looking for is availability and time. And then stay in touch with them, encourage them. What can I do for you? Send them a text every so often, just checking in. When you're a believer, and a lot of the people I talk to and make relationships with are believers, that connects you on a deeper level. And so you tell them you're praying for them, and be real and pray for them. Use social media to stay connected, share some stuff there and they share some stuff and comment and like the posts, and just, it's a variety of different things that you do to maintain relationships. I think it's one of my strongest, suits that I have that I've been able to do for 7 years now, 26 years in broadcasting, is maintain relationships and try to never burn a bridge. Try to never, rip people apart on social media. There are people that I didn't get along with for sure during different times of my career, but you'll never hear me talk about that publicly or put on social media, because I'm not here to burn any relationships or bridges. People are people. So that's really how I've been able to do that for so many years, and hopefully continue to do that for as long as I can.
And I do have one more question,
Yeah.
D2, because I like looking, just to find out that there was a sport media company that talks about fate was just mind blowing to me. That's like I had to have you on the
Yeah.
show talk about it. But you know, looking through the page and just like looking through the different content, I realized like there's some of these athletes, you know, I may have seen them on play, whether it's basketball, football, or baseball, and I would never know that they're quote unquote Christian or they, you know, have anything related to the faith. So
Yeah.
how do you like, you know, like what's the process for you to, okay, this person is a Christian, they will want to talk about their faith. Because, you know, I know how some people don't want to, like they want to keep work separate from their own faith. So how do you kind of make it a comfortable space for them to want to share about their faith?
It's a great question. It's one I get a lot because how do you know that they're a Christian, right? Like, how do you know that this person or that person? For the majority of the interviews I have on, it's usually either A, someone that I've seen talk about their faith somewhere else, or B, someone that I know that knows that person who says, yeah, they're solid. Like they're the real deal. They believe in Jesus and their walk is very serious to them. That's the majority of interviews. Every so often, though, in fact, I did one last week, and I won't name names, that they were a part of something that was faith-based, and I assumed they were a Christian. And so I had them on, and when I asked them about their faith, they just said, my faith is very private. You know, everybody should have a faith and believe in something bigger than themselves. That was the answer when I asked them about their faith. So I said, okay, and I'm not here to judge that person at all. It's just I didn't know that that person wasn't a believer in Jesus. And I could have pressed him. I could have said, wait, do you believe in Jesus or are you just believing in God? But I could sense in his answer that he didn't want to talk about his faith. That's okay. So the interview is a little bit shorter than most of our interviews, but we moved on. But that doesn't happen too often. Most of the conversations, like today, I did an interview. It was awesome with Benjamin Watson. And that's coming out on the podcast very soon. And Benjamin played in the NFL for years and has a new book. And Benjamin's a follower of Christ. Like you just know if you ever heard, and I know him, like we've had a friendship for many years. So I know that he's, you know, all in on Jesus. So those interviews are different. Like that's a guy that I have a relationship with that I know. And we're just talking about some different topics and some different, you know, conversations that were taking place. But I'm not questioning his faith ever. But there are others that, you know, somebody might say, hey, you know, this guy's pretty solid. You should talk to them. Or this woman is pretty solid. You should talk to her. And then we have the conversation and see where it goes.
No, that is really amazing. And my last question to wrap up this interview, you know, where do you see yourself, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years, or what are some of your future goals and aspirations in the sports ministry media space?
That is a great question because I think about that a lot. You know, I'm going to be 50 years old this September. And, you know, I don't know what happens when you turn 50 and you enter into your 50s. Are you still valuable? Are you still important? Can you still produce good work? I hope so. I'm going to try. I don't have any plans to retire yet. Maybe someday when I get into my 60s, I might step back a little bit. But I don't ever see myself not doing something to serve Jesus in the world of sports. I just don't see that now. Maybe someday God calls me back into, you know, vocational work, regular work, if you will, in the sports space or the broadcasting space. But I don't know. I'm not here to say God can't do whatever he wants. He could take me out of sports media if he wanted to. But I know I want to serve him. And, you know, I'm an elder in my church. I volunteer in my church, sometimes speak, travel around the country, share my story. Wherever that looks like, ultimately I'm doing it because I just want to glorify God and point people to him. So in 5 to 10 years, man, I'd love to see Sports Spectrum quadruple its audience in 5 years, right? I'd love to see Sports Spectrum grow and grow and grow in an amazing way, and then be able to hand that off to people much younger than me to carry the torch, just like I'm carrying the torch from people before me. I would love to see more entities talking about Jesus in the world of sports. I'd love to see more sports spectrums. You know, we're
Yeah.
not here to dominate an industry and be the only one. Like, I would love to see 3 or 4 more podcast networks or shows that would be about Jesus and sports. You know, I dream about doing documentaries someday. Maybe that's something that I can go into and do sports and faith documentaries. So I don't know what it means. I don't know where I'll be exactly. I hope I'm alive to be able to do it. But ultimately, it's just to serve Jesus, and then below that, really, is serving my wife and continuing to try and be the best husband I can to her, and serving my daughter who's in college now. And in 5 to 10 years, man, I hope I'm a grandfather by the time we get to that 10-year mark, because that would be the coolest thing ever to be a grandpa. So we'll see what God has in store. But I think about it a lot, but I don't dwell on it because I know it's not really my call anyways. The Lord orders my steps, not Jason.
That's very amazing, and I definitely look forward to you do create a documentary. I definitely want to say, thank you very much, Jason, for taking time out your day
Yeah.
to tell about your story, say about your journey, and for those who are listening, like always, I hope this inspires you. I hope this encourages you. If you can leave a word of wisdom for someone who have heard your story, who may still feel like they don't know how they can combine their love for sports and faith together, what would you say to that person as a word of wisdom?
Trust in God, serve others, be great at what you do. If you do those 3 things, you will be successful. Trust in God, that's number 1. Serve others, that's the second thing. It's God, others, ourself, right? So trust in God, serve others, and do great work. Put the effort in. Don't be lazy. And I promise you, you will be successful.
That's amazing. And for those who are listening, like always, if you guys have yet to subscribe to us on YouTube, and also leave us a review on Apple Podcast, and see you guys next week. Thank you again, Mr. Jason.
You're welcome, buddy. Thanks for having me.